If you haven't heard Reverend Hodges, we are in for a huge treat today. So a little bit of housekeeping. I want to thank our Marketing and Communications Department, our IT department, our special events coordinator for setting everything up for us. We couldn't have done it without them. Thank you. This is a presentation that is being brought to you, was sponsored by the Government and Community Relations Committee and the Daughtah Historic Foundation. So we've done this in tandem. We are so fortunate to have our guest come here today. You can imagine how busy this month has been and will be, continues to be for him. This is going to be such a short introduction because I don't think anybody could talk about himself as well as he could, but he's here to share his background, his experience, his knowledge of Low Country history, and the people who have made history and the people who continue to make history. And I think we have somebody right here. So I'd like to welcome Reverend Kenneth Hodges as our guest speaker today. And if you would come on up.
Let me say good afternoon. Good afternoon. And thank you, Ms. Harris, for that very kind introduction. And thank you for this opportunity for me to come and share some thoughts with you today. I must admit that I don't know who she was introducing. Where do we start? How many of you were born and raised in Beaufort County? Okay. Let me say welcome to the South Carolina Low Country. You are blessed to be able to come to such a region. I am a little familiar with this region, even though when I was growing up I didn't know how pristine and how important the region was. Let me just say a little about me, my background, and growing up, or should I say growing up Gullah in this community. If someone asked me how did I get to Daughtah today, I would have to tell them that I came the long way. And I say that because I was born and reared on one of the little barrier islands not very far from here. I do have a map, but you can't see it from there. I can't even see it as close as I am. One of the unique things about this area is that there are many barrier islands. I know some of you may go out in your boats. You see Daughtah Island, Cusor Island, Monkey Island, Morgan Island, and then the St. Helena Sound. This is a unique area. What makes it so unique? Historically, there were many enslaved Africans who were brought to this region. And the reason they were brought to this region was because of three major crops. Indigo for a while, then cotton, and then rice. Can you imagine the people enslaved who made cotton king and rice gold. But that's why they came. When you go out along the waterways and see some of the embankments and some of the swamp areas, it's hard to imagine that there was a time when those places were overgrown, cypress and other trees. And the only way that those swamp areas could be transformed into a factory that would produce rice was that it required manual labor. No heavy equipment. Even if they had heavy equipment, they were bogged down. So it was the labor, people bogging around in muddy swamps, infested with mosquito, alligators, moccasins, and yet they labored. The challenge was turning the rice fields into a factory. I mean, with cotton, you're up on higher ground, you still have to clear it out, and you didn't have heavy equipment. And then there's this region close enough to the ocean, but far enough inland. But those who brought enslaved persons to this region discovered that there were some on the west coast of Africa who possessed rice-producing skills. And many of them were brought to this region because they possessed those skills. On these rivers that were close enough to the ocean where they could build the dams and the dikes to develop rice fields, there were places like the Combahee River, the Ashepoo River, and the Edisto River right in this area. You know it. You heard the term, the Ace Basin. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about the Ashepoo, Combahee, and the Edisto, the Ace Basin. Densely populated with enslaved workers. That's the environment that I came up in. My foreparents were born on the other side of the St. Helena Somme, but had relatives on both sides. St. Helena, but also in Edisto. And it was there in those rice fields and cotton fields along the coast where they labored. My roots go deep in that area. Many of my family members live on Edisto, some on St. Helena, some in a little area called Bennett's Point, Green Pond. It was so isolated that in order for them to educate their children, they had to start a school in their own houses. And then eventually on one of the barrier islands, we call it Cebu, but it's actually South Fenwick, right on the other side of the St. Helena Somme. It was there that they started a school, they started a church, and eventually the county established a school. And the school only went to, some say 6th, but it really was 8th grade. And then after the 8th grade, if they wanted to go any further, they would have to move across the waters and sometimes spend a week or a month or sometimes the entire school season with a relative on this side of the river. That's the environment that I grew up in. So when I said, how did I get here? I came the long way. I could have crossed just over water, but I came the long way. And let me talk a little about that long way. I grew up and I was born in a small community called Bennett's Point. When I grew up, the population was less than 75 people. We encountered a lot of challenges in my life. I experienced some challenges at a young age. I was one of 12 children. I lost my mother when I was 12 in 1965. I lost my father in 1970, the same year I graduated from high school. When I graduated from high school, I, like many others who you often hear about it, the great migration to the north had been going on for years, but even as late as 1970, I too participated. I left South Carolina and went to New York. I stayed there for about 2 years with a brother. But I really was trying to prepare to go to college. I graduated from Walterboro High School and didn't have the best SAT scores. And so I weren't getting the type of scholarship that I thought I would get for running track in high school. So I worked in New York for 2 years, and then I decided to return to the South. And I enrolled in Clark College in Atlanta. No one told me that you couldn't get in college without money. The little money that I saved up in the 2 years that I was in New York, I got an airline ticket and bought some supplies, and that was about it. How do you get in college with no money? You will discover that there's some unique traits that a genuine Gullah has. Now, they're going to make it one way or the other. I enrolled at Clark College with basically no money. I think it was less than $100 that I had left. When I was in high school, I used to run track. That was a challenge, living on Bennett's Point. Elementary school was 17 miles away from my home from Bennett's Point. The high school was 34 miles one way. That's the environment I came up in. I decided to run track. The buses didn't run after school, so whenever I had track practice, I had to hitchhike, sometimes 34 miles one way. Some nights I didn't get home. I would spend the night with an uncle or someone else, and sometimes I didn't get home till very late at night. But that was the challenge. I ran track, and I always loved to run. Established a school 80-yard run. My daddy told me when he was sick, he said, son, go in and run. You never know what's going to happen as a result of that. As I said earlier, my SAT scores wasn't as good as I would like for them to have been. And that's another story. How do you get in college with no money? I took an envelope with some certificates and some ribbons and a few medals that I'd won running track at Walterboro High School, and went and sat down with the athletic director and the coach. And even though I had been out of school 2 years, they invested in me and gave me a partial scholarship. And I was able to enroll in Clark College. That got me in the door now. How do you eat and how do you buy supplies? It was a challenge. Over the course of time, I got an interest in photography, and I bought a small camera. And my instructor, he singled me out to go on some assignments. As his students, as one of his students, he was very shy, even though he was an instructor. He didn't like big events. And so on one occasion, he sent me out on an assignment. Really the first newspaper job or assignment that I was sent out on. I got to the event that night, and lo and behold, the event was an anniversary celebration of the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King. They were honoring Coretta King and Cesar Chavez and some others that night. And the person who was presenting the awards went on to become the President of the United States, Governor Jimmy Carter. I took some pictures, I came back, I developed it that night and got it to my instructor, and lo and behold, the next day it appeared on the cover of the Atlanta World. But the credit went to my instructor. I still have the pictures. I paste my name over here. And I have the negatives. But little did I know that I would have an opportunity. One who came a long way, from right across the river, through New York, and now in Atlanta. And here I am shooting the person who will become the governor and the wife of the late Dr. Martin Luther King. And Cesar Chavez, who did so much for the struggle and the liberation of his people. I went on to shoot many other events and eventually took the skill that I developed in photography and created a small business. I was studying business in college, and I had the strange philosophy that a person who studied business should be about starting a business. And so I started my own small business even while I was still a student. And the year that I graduated, I licensed it as a business, and I called it Live Ben Sons Photo Services. And it was named after my deceased parents. My mother's name was Lydia, and my father's name was Benjamin. And so I called it Live Ben Sons. That was 1977. I was able to photograph basically anyone who came through Atlanta who was somebody I have on file. And eventually you'll see many of those because we'll be developing some exhibits and a few books and a couple of documentaries. Eventually I entered the ministry. But while I was in Atlanta, I was influenced by so many others, the Maynard Jackson, the Andy Young. I followed his campaign. John Lewis, I followed his campaign and photographed all of their campaigns. So they influenced many of us. After I graduated from Morehouse School of Religion, I came back to South Carolina to pastor a church in Bennettsville, South Carolina. Many of you heard of Marion Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund. Well, the church I went to pastor, her father used to pastor it, her brother used to pastor it, and it was her home church. And I pastored that church for about 9 years. Because of the influence of a person like Maynard Jackson, Dr. Benjamin Mays, and Andrew Young, I sought a seat on the Bennettsville City Council after we sued the city for single-member district. And I was elected. I served there for 9 years while I served as pastor of Tabernacle of Shiloh. At the end of that 9 year, I came back to this region. I should have just come right across the water. But instead, I'm coming the long way. From Bennetts Point to New York to Atlanta and to Bennettsville to now coming back into Beaufort. I became the pastor of the Tabernacle Baptist Church. Some of you have heard of it, some of you have passed by. Tabernacle is a unique church. Little did I know growing up on the Ashepoo River and the Edisto River on the other side of the waters, Little did I know of all that was going on in this environment. That's why I have such a passion for preserving history and telling the story so that others will know. When I came to Tabernacle, there in the yard is a bust of Robert Smalls, that story that many of us didn't hear about on the other side of the river. And then hearing the stories of Harriet Tubman who came to this area. So first let me just say a little word about the Tabernacle. Tabernacle is a unique church. The building is the building dates back to about 1811. The Baptist Church of Beaufort, which is the traditional white Baptist church. Some of you may be members there. Any members from Baptist Church of Beaufort there? The Baptist Church of Beaufort was established in downtown Beaufort in 1804. Shortly after the church was established, there was a congregational split, just a family fight. The going party went around the corner and built a structure. In a couple of years, they reconciled and went back home. They left the building around the corner. And that building was used as a lecture hall for the enslaved persons, because the enslaved persons worshiped in the same church in the balcony of the Baptist Church of Beaufort with their owners. So they started using the building around the corner as a lecture hall for the enslaved blacks. And they continue to do that. And all of a sudden, you know the story how the Civil War began. Many right up the street from that Tabernacle assembled in what we know now as Cessation House, and they had the brilliant idea that they were going to leave the country. They were seceding. The Civil War erupted. The Confederates took Fort Sumter, and the Union forces had a challenge along the coast. They studied the coast, and then they decided that they needed a foothold on the East Coast. And lo and behold, they discovered that one of the deepest harbors was right outside of Beaufort, in Port Royal. And so, November 7th, 1861, the federal troop bombarded Beaufort, the coast, an armada of vessels, gunshots. Enslaved persons in the field called it the day of the big gun shoot. They knew something major was happening even though they didn't know the extent of it. The Confederates issued the evacuation order. In other words, all whites went further inland. Overseers of enslaved persons, owners of plantations, businesses. So what did I do for those who were enslaved? 1861, November. Those enslaved persons, even on this island, no doubt, were abruptly freed. As early as 1861. You've heard a lot about the Port Royal experience. When they talk about the Port Royal experience, they're not just talking about Port Royal. Port Royal Island started up at Whale Branch and it went all the way down Beaufort, Parasol, Port Royal. What do you do for persons who were enslaved for so many years, who knew the skills of producing rice and turning it into gold and making cotton king, but they've never been educated? What do? Federal troops occupied Beaufort. The appeal went to many Northerners and many towns and cities in the states where many of you are from. And if you check the records, you'll discover that many of your ancestors also came to this region. And why did they come? They came to help aid those persons who were abruptly freed. And so they came. They came as missionaries. They came as educators. They came as military personnel, overseers of plantations. That's why you hear out of that era, you hear the story of a pen center right up the street. Well, that's why they came. They were northern missionaries who came to aid them in the establishment of educational institutions. So out of that environment, the Penn Center developed in 1862. Many of our churches was established during that period of time. A person like Solomon Peck from Boston, Massachusetts, was instrumental in helping to establish the Tabernacle Baptist Church as an official church and the Brick Baptist Church as an official church. So those persons who were abruptly freed, others came in to aid, but they were also trying to do some things for themselves. That band of former slaves who were abruptly freed, who were worshiping in Beaufort, and that building right around the corner that became the lecture hall, they continued to worship in that building. And then they developed it into an official congregation, formally establishing it as the first Black Baptist church in Beaufort in 1863. Many of you saw the article that was in the paper a month or so ago about how that congregation met in that building months prior to the reading of the Emancipation in 1863. And then on January 1, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was actually read in Beaufort at Smith Plantation, it tells the story, and the document shows that those persons in the Tabernacle Baptist Church assembled, and they said that they had been assembling there for at least the last 5 months. And there they drafted proclamations thanking Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, for freeing the slaves January 1, 1863. And the document is a part of the Abraham Lincoln Papers, and it's good to know that on this Presidential Day. That is part of Abraham Lincoln's paper in the Library of Congress. Tabernacle has a unique history. It served as a school for many of those persons who were abruptly freed, just like Penn and others. There were other schools in the city, Wesley, Tabernacle, and other structures as well. On that campus, we see the bust of Robert Smalls. And when we think about that environment, that time when the federal troops occupied Beaufort in November 1861, Robert Smalls was born and was enslaved in Beaufort. He was born in 1839. But when he was 12 years old, his owner hired him out to work in Charleston. So when the war began, Robert Smalls knew, and he could hear the stories of how back home in Beaufort, his people, others that he was associated with, were free. So here we find a genuine Gullah, a person 22 years old at the time, found himself working on the Confederate vessel because he knew these waterways. He was working on the Planter. The Planter was a cargo vessel, but he knew all of the waterways where they transported and picked up cotton and rice and carried supplies. And then when the war began, the Confederates took the Planter over and made it an army vessel. And Robert Small found himself working on a Confederate vessel, and no doubt he discovered that he was working on the wrong side. So he developed a plan, a strategy. He observed and he watched and he knew that there were times when a person's over the Planter, the crew would go in town just to let loose a little. He picked the time when they were going in town and they left the vessel. He had a strategy wherein he, along with his crew members and some of his family, decided that that was the night to steal away. And so Robert Smalls and his crew captured the Planter and headed out to the ocean. Heading out through the harbors of Charleston, past Fort Sumter. I told you earlier that the Confederates had taken Fort Sumter. He had to go past that. He dressed himself in the captain's attire and gave the appropriate whistle. And they passed the Planter and let him go by. And when they looked and they saw that something was funny, but at that time he was out of the firing range. So he's coming out to the ocean now. And many of the Union vessels were. And lo and behold, what's coming? A Confederate vessel. They didn't tell the Union forces that they were coming, so they looked like a Confederate vessel coming to bombard them. But Robert's wife had a sheet on board. They hoisted the sheet, and the Union forces saw the sheet, and they allowed Robert Smalls and his crew to come on board. When he got there, he said, "I'm Robert Smalls. And I thought Uncle Abe could have use of this vessel." And he turned it over to the Union forces. That didn't really, a lot of people think it took place near Charleston. He came out of Charleston. If you look at the coastline, it's very close. But actually, old documents said it was near Order Island. Order Island is right across the river. Now, Order Island is also at the foot of the island where I said I was born. So all of this took place in these very waters. Robert Smalls came back into Beaufort, got involved in politics. You know the rest of the story. He was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. He was elected to South Carolina Senate. He was elected to Congress, and he served 5 terms in Congress. He is actually known as one of the first heroes of the Civil War. His story spread abroad. Here you find a man, 22 years old, May 13th of 1862, capturing the Planter. And by the end of the summer, he is sitting in the office with the President of the United States, trying to convince him to allow blacks to enter the military. And it happened. He came back and he was involved in recruiting colored troops. What a story. A person up from slavery, these same waterways. Descendants of those same persons who were brought from Africa. What a story. And he made tremendous contributions. Many people don't know that Paris Island is there because of some legislation that he helped to foster that created a naval yard on Paris Island. The naval yard actually moved to Charleston eventually, but the property remained and then became Paris Island. That's Robert Smith. That is a quest for freedom. A person who risked his life, the life of his family, to steal away, risked encountering the Union forces who didn't know he was coming, a person who was involved in over 17 battles during the Civil War. What a story. If these marshes and oak trees could talk, they would tell you some of those stories as you walk and look out over the vistas. What a story. I mentioned earlier that when the Union forces occupied Beaufort and the enslaved persons were abruptly freed, the appeal went forth and many Northerners came to aid them. Many of them were missionaries, many of them were educators, many of them were in the health profession. But another person came during that same era. She was not an educator. Governor Andrews of Massachusetts was aware of this person. He knew of the work that this person had done with John Brown. So he recommended this person to the Union forces. He told them, I believe this person can aid you in Beaufort and in that battle. And lo and behold, in the spring of 1862, who pops up in Beaufort? Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman came to Beaufort in the spring of 1862. She was not an educator, but she was a gifted individual. And she was a servant. She served as a nurse. And some of her writing, she tells the story how she went into and they washed the bodies and the basin became bloody. And the flies were all around, blacks and whites. She served as a nurse. She opened an eating house. She was a gifted and skilled cook as well. But she opened the eating house so that many of these formerly enslaved females could provide food and make a living from the Union forces. You mean she opened a catering establishment in Beaufort? Thinking woman, she discovers, well, they're eating well, but they also need their clothes washed. So she opened a laundry house. Same thing. So the women could provide services. But she was also a spy and a scout. She had a way of blending in with the community. She could go into the worship services where the local gullahs were meeting, just blend in. She could be along the waterways and she could hear the stories of those who came from further inland, telling the stories of how there are still pockets of Confederate soldiers up the Columbia River and up the Asheville. And so she gleaned all of that information, and along with Colonel Montgomery, she developed a strategy go up the Columbia River These places are right close there. You on Cusor. You on Data and then Cusor and Monkey Island, Morgan. That's Cusor River. She developed a strategy wherein they would go up the Combahee River and liberate those enslaved persons who were still working those plantations. So along with Colonel Montgomery, Governor Andrews certainly was right when he said that she could aid them, because she too was helping Robert Smalls fulfill that objective of recruiting colored troops as well. So on the night of June 1st, 1863, 3 vessels assembled under the cover of darkness at the docks in Beaufort. And under the cover of darkness, those 3 vessels headed out the Beaufort River, up the Cusor River right by you, out into the St. Helena Sound River by you, and then headed up the Combahee River. They got off those vessels at a place called Fields Point, not very far from where I was born. And those persons started fleeing from those plantations towards the vessel. They headed further up. And as they went, others fled. In one night, over 750 enslaved persons stole away to freedom, got on board those vessels, came back into Beaufort, assembled in the church, that same church, they built around the corner, and those former enslaved persons continued to worship in and established as a church. There they assembled with those 750 plus. They were addressed by Harry Tubman, Colonel Montgomery, and others. And some of them were housed there temporarily until they could be placed other places. Harry Tubman tells the story of how she personally led over 100 of the men to the recruiter's office. And it then became part of the colored troops. Harry Tubman walked those very streets. What a story. A person who had already secured her freedom, who could have said, I'm through with it, but she wanted to reach out to others. And so she came to this area and she served. You know the story that when the Civil War ended, she went to New York and bought some property from Mr. Seward and bought a home, and she established into an elder care house where she helped to feed those who were hungry, clothe those who were naked, and where she lived a full life and died in 1913. The only phase of her Southern campaign happened in Beaufort. The entire Civil War she spent here. So we decided that we needed to do something about that. Since I came the long way and wound up in Tabernacle, and pastoring Tabernacle, a place where Robert Smalls was buried, and with such a rich history, where Harry Tubman came and assembled, and we felt that we needed to do something. I was elected to the General Assembly and served about 11 years, and I decided not to seek re-election. But the first piece of legislation that I introduced when I became a member of the South Carolina House of Representatives was to introduce a piece of legislation to name the future bridge over the Combahee River, the Harriet Tubman Bridge. Some of you passed over that bridge on your way to Charleston. That's how it happened. I introduced the legislation to name that bridge the Harriet Tubman Bridge. A lot of people didn't know the story of Harriet Tubman being in this area. Then they started to say, why is this name Harriet Tubman? Then they started researching. So I see that crosses the Combahee River. That's where the last vessel went, and that's where they crossed over that causeway. And so that bridge is named the Harriet Tubman Bridge. We officially dedicated it when it was completed in 2008. A few years later, we decided to honor her in a more meaningful way. We wanted to build a monument to place it on the grounds of the Tabernacle Baptist Church that is so rich in history, such a unique juncture in this nation's history and that whole era of Reconstruction and everything else. We wanted to build a monument to place it there. When we launched the campaign, it was late 2016. We anticipated it would take about 5 years. We were about on schedule, but COVID came in the middle of it, slowed it down a little. We decided to raise funds from the private sector first. People gave, their names will be listed when we dedicate the monument. Their names will be listed in various categories that they gave in, and people wanted to be a part of it. We reached out to those churches and others, and we told them that those who gave at least $1,000, their names would be placed there at the monument. And churches and others just wanted to be a part of that. We had different giving levels from about $250 up to $10,000, named after the waterways of the area: the Port Royal Sound, the St. Helena Sound, the Cusco Sound Circle, the St. Helena Sound Circle, and then the Combahee River Circle. The Combahee River Circle is the top where a person give $10,000 and up. There are a few people who made it to the Combahee, and thank God I made it there as well. But we're still raising funds. We're looking forward to unveiling that, hopefully, in a little over a year. Why are we doing that? Because of the unique history of this area. Stories that others will never hear about. If only these trees could talk. And sometimes if you listen close enough, when you hear those tide going in and coming out, maybe you can hear them say, this is a unique place. And there are some untold stories. And that you are so fortunate to be in this area. So I stand here today. I should have came right across the water. But I came a long way. With all that's going on in this area, this is a unique time to be right where you are. You sit in what is called the Gullah Geechee Corridor by law. You're right in the area where the National Park Service Reconstruction Era Monument is. You're right up this river from where the International African American Museum will be dedicated in Charleston in the near future. Where I see people every day coming wanting to learn more about this area and just want to be a part of it. And that's what drew many of you. And we want you to be a part of it in any way you can. Anything we can ever do, we'll be glad to. You've already blessed me by giving me an opportunity to come and share with you today, just to tell part of the story. Ms. Harris told me not to give my 3-day lecture, but just to talk for an hour.